All right, let's take a little walk on the dark side of history, shall we? This isn't the stuff you learned about in your high school textbook. We're about to dive into some of the most creative, seriously cruel, and just, well, terrifying ways people have come up with to punish each other. So I want you to think about the last time you had a really bad day. Maybe you got a parking ticket. Maybe your Wi Fi decided to just die. We've all been there, right? But hold that thought before you go calling it the worst day ever. Let's get a little bit of historical perspective, because I promise you, your definition of a bad day, it's about to get a major, major upgrade. Or maybe a downgrade. You'll see. Okay, first up, pain by design. We're talking about torture as a tool. These are the punishments that were, less about justice and more about pure engineering. Devices and methods that were meticulously, carefully crafted to inflict the absolute maximum amount of pain, usually to get someone to talk. So let's kick things off with a real classic, straight out of the Tower of London, the rack. Picture this. It's basically a big wooden frame, kind of like a ladder, but the goal here wasn't to kill you. Nope. The whole point was to get information, to make you confess, by quite literally pulling your body apart. And the way it worked was just horrifyingly simple. First, they'd secure your wrists and ankles. Then they'd start turning a ratchet. And with every single turn, the ropes would get tighter and tighter, putting this just unbearable strain on your shoulders, your hips, your knees, your elbows, until pop, everything starts dislocating. There's a story from 1447 about a woman named Anne Askew. She was put on the rack for her religious beliefs, and they stretched her so badly that every single one of her joints was pulled apart. She literally had to be carried to her own execution in a chair. All right, so most of us have heard of hanging, right? But what about gibbeting? See, hanging, the goal there is death. But gibbeting? Oh, that was all about sending a very long, very public, and very smelly warning. It's what happened after you were already dead. Think of it as public relations, just, with a lot more rotting corpses. So, after England passed the Murder Act in 1752, this became a pretty common sight. They'd stick your body in a tight steel cage, hoist you up more than 30 feet in the air, usually on a busy road or near a town's water source, and just leave you there. The whole idea was for everyone passing by to see you and think, yeah, maybe I won't do that. The problem? People who lived nearby would complain constantly because the smell of, well, was so awful they couldn't sleep. And when I say they left you, they really meant it. Some of these remains were found hanging around for over 20 years. Now, if you thought things were bad on land, let's head out to sea. This is where punishments got, well, really inventive. Meet keel hauling. This was the stuff of nightmares for sailors, usually saved for someone who stole something or started a fight. It's pretty straightforward. They tie you to a rope, loop it completely underneath the ship, toss you overboard on one side, and then the whole crew would pull you all the way under and up the other side. And what made this so awful was that it was a triple threat. I mean, there were three main ways you could die. First, you could just drown. Obvious, right? Second, you could smash your head on the keel. That's the big beam running down the bottom of the ship. And third, and maybe the gnarliest, you could get absolutely shredded by all the sharp barnacles covering the hull. It was basically like being dragged over a giant underwater cheese grater. Yeah, your chances of surviving were not great. Okay, so if man-made gadgets weren't brutal enough for you, don't worry, some rulers decided to outsource their punishments. This next part is all about when animals attack or, punishments gone wild. We're talking about weaponizing the animal kingdom in some seriously bizarre ways. Apparently, he makes a damn good soup. Yeah, you heard that. That quote is from a story about the fourth Mughal emperor of India. He was using an elephant to execute people, and he ended up pardoning one murderer. Why? Because the guy had cooked his victim into a soup and fed it to his family. The emperor figured, hey, he's a good cook. It just shows you the level of casual cruelty we're dealing with here. And yeah, execution by elephant was a real thing. It was a huge spectacle, all about showing off the ruler's power. Look how I can control this giant, deadly animal. And you didn't have to be a murderer to get this sentence. It could be for something like tax evasion. You had a few options. There was the quick crush, where they just put your head on a pedestal and bloop, splat. Or the slow crush, where the elephant would just kind of walk over you again and again. And if the ruler was feeling really theatrical, a specially trained elephant would crush your limbs one by one, saving your head for last. All right, let's jump over to ancient Rome for this next one. It's called poena culli, which literally means penalty of the sack. And this one was saved for what they considered the worst crime imaginable, murdering a close family member. The punishment sounds simple enough. They sew you into a leather sack. But you're not alone in there. So, who are your new roommates? Well, inside the sock with the murderer, they'd put one dog, one rooster, one viper, and one monkey. Yep, a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Then they'd sew the whole thing up and toss it in a river. I have absolutely no idea what the thinking was behind that specific combination of animals, but can you just imagine the pure panicked chaos inside that bag right before it hits the water? That is one seriously bad situation. And then there's rat torture. And you really get to see the twisted creativity of people here. There were a couple of main methods. The first one involves a heated bowl. Back in the 16th century, a Dutch leader came up with this. You put a bowl over a prisoner's stomach with a rat trapped inside, and then you heat the top of the bowl. The rat, desperate to escape the heat, has only one way to go: down, by burrowing into the victim. And then there's a more modern version, reportedly used in Chile under Pinochet, which they nicknamed the rectoscope. It involved a tube, a rat, and, well, I'm just going to let you use your imagination for where that goes. Okay, so some of these punishments weren't about a quick, violent finish. For these next ones, the real torture was time itself. We're talking about the slowest goodbyes, where the entire point was to stretch out the process of dying for as long as humanly possible. And that brings us to scaphism. It was also called the boats, and it was an ancient Persian specialty. Here's the setup. You're trapped inside a hollowed-out boat, or a log, tied down so you can't move. Only your head, hands, and feet are sticking out. And then the meal begins. This is just pure nightmare fuel. On day one, they start force-feeding you milk and honey. But this isn't a treat. The goal is to give you horrible, uncontrollable diarrhea. At the same time, they're smearing your exposed body parts with honey. So pretty soon, this cocktail of filth and sweetness attracts insects. All the insects. They start to bite you, burrow into your flesh, lay eggs. And the worst part, every single day, they come back and feed you more milk and honey, just to keep you alive and prolong the whole thing. There was one poor guy who reportedly survived like this for 17 days. You know, sometimes the name of the punishment tells you everything you need to know. And that's definitely the case with the oubliette. It comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. And that was the entire chilling point. You weren't just imprisoned, you were put somewhere to be completely, utterly forgotten. Just think about that. Forgotten. You're dropped through a hatch in the ceiling into a pitch-black cell. Sometimes they were so small you couldn't even stand up or lie down properly. And that was it. No food, no water. You were just left there, alone in the dark, to slowly die of starvation and dehydration. And a lot of the time, you weren't truly alone, because the rotting corpse of the last person they forgot about was down there with you. So it's really easy to hear about all this and think it sounds like something from a horror movie, right? But this is the thing. These punishments weren't just stories. They left behind cold, hard evidence. Real echoes of cruelty. Take Leap Castle in Ireland. Back in the early 1900s, some workers were doing renovations, and they found an oubliette. And what they found inside wasn't just a skeleton or two. No, they found enough human remains to fill multiple cartloads. Think about that. So many people had been forgotten in that one hole that it took several carts to haul all the bones away. And that's really the crucial point here, isn't it? From the rack, to the boats, to the oubliette, these weren't just scary stories people told around a campfire. They were real. They were organized, state-sanctioned, systematic ways of punishing actual human beings. So that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. You know, the specific punishments, the cages, the sacks, the boats, they're gone. They belong to history. But what about the impulse behind them? That human capacity for cruelty that dreamed them up in the first place. Has that really been forgotten? Or does it just wear a different mask these days?